In the middle of World War II, German soldiers on the Eastern Front began hearing something in the dark. Not an engine, not at first. Something quieter, a soft rushing sound above the trees, a whisper in the night sky. Then came the bombs. By the time the soldiers heard the sound, it was usually too late. The aircraft had already glided over them with its engine cut, dropped its explosives, and disappeared back into the darkness. The Germans gave the pilots a name: Nachthexen, night witches. And the strangest part is that the pilots loved it, because the so-called witches were not supernatural. They were young Soviet women flying outdated wooden biplanes with almost no protection, little sleep, freezing air, and a job most people thought they could not do. No radar, often no parachutes, planes made of plywood and canvas, open cockpits, maps on their knees, cold wind in their faces, and beneath them, one of the most brutal wars in human history. This is the story of the night witches, and I promise you, the scariest thing in the sky was not the plane. It was the women who kept coming back. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the war became a catastrophe almost immediately. Cities burned, armies collapsed, families were torn apart, millions of people were thrown into a fight for survival. Across the Soviet Union, women wanted to serve. Some had already trained as pilots before the war. Some had flown in clubs. Some had aviation experience. Some were barely out of school and were furious that men were being sent to fight while they were told to wait. One of the women who changed that was Marina Raskova. Raskova was already famous in the Soviet Union. She was an aviator, navigator, record setter, and national hero. People sometimes called her the Soviet Amelia Earhart, which is useful for Western audiences, but honestly, she was not a copy of anyone. She was her own kind of dangerous. Women wrote to her, asking for a chance to fight, not to sew uniforms, not to serve tea, not to sit safely behind the front while their cities were bombed. They wanted to fly. Raskova pushed the Soviet leadership to create women's combat air units. Eventually, the order came. Women would be trained for combat aviation. One of those units became the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the Night Witches. At first, men in the Soviet military did not take them seriously. The women were young. Some were teenagers. Many were in their early 20s. They were issued uniforms that did not fit, boots too large for their feet, and equipment built for male soldiers. Some male officers laughed at them. Some doubted they would last. Some treated the entire idea like a political experiment that would eventually crash into a field and be forgotten. The women did not have the luxury of caring. They trained hard. They learned navigation, maintenance, bombing, survival discipline, and how to fly in conditions that would make a reasonable person apologize to the aircraft and go home. Then they were sent to the front, and the planes they were given were almost insulting. The Polikarpov Po-2 was slow, old and fragile. It had been designed before the war as a training and crop dusting aircraft. It was made largely of wood and canvas. It had an open cockpit. It carried only a small bomb load. It had no armor. It could be damaged by small arms fire. In a war full of steel, speed, and modern machines, the Po-2 looked like something that had wandered in from a different century, carrying paperwork. But the plane had one advantage. It was quiet, and it could fly very low. At night, that mattered. The night witches developed a terrifying method. They would approach German positions in darkness, then cut their engines and glide toward the target. The only warning was the sound of wind through the wires and wings. A soft whoosh. A broomstick sound, the Germans said. That was where the witch name came from. Then the bombs fell. The Po-2 could not carry much, so the women flew again and again. One mission was not enough. They would drop their bombs, return to base, reload, refuel, and take off again. Some crews flew many sorties in a single night. Imagine that. Not one terrifying flight, many, night after night. You climb into an open cockpit, the air is freezing. The engine coughs awake, the runway is dark. Somewhere ahead are searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, enemy soldiers, and the very real chance that you will not come back. You fly anyway. You drop your bombs, you return. Then someone hands you more bombs, and you go again. That was the rhythm of their war. The Night Witches were not flying comfortable machines with advanced instruments. Navigation could be brutally difficult. They flew in darkness, bad weather, cold, smoke, and enemy fire. Their cockpits were open to the elements. In winter, the cold could be vicious. Hands numbed, faces froze, instruments were limited. A mistake in navigation could mean missing the target, running out of fuel, or landing somewhere no Soviet pilot wanted to land. And still they flew. The Germans began to fear them because the raids were relentless. The bombs were not always huge, but that was not the only point. The Night Witches were also attacking sleep, morale, nerves, the feeling of safety behind the line. A soldier can prepare for a tank. He can dig a trench. He can watch the horizon. But how do you prepare for a whisper in the dark that comes back every hour? That was the psychological weapon. The Night Witches made the night itself feel hostile. German troops reportedly spread rumors about them. Some claimed the women had been given special injections to see in the dark. Others thought their skill must be unnatural, because apparently the easier explanation was witchcraft, not admitting that young women in obsolete aircraft were outsmarting them. That is one of the darker little comedies of the war. The Nazis could believe in an empire, racial mythology, and half a continent burning under their boots. But women pilots doing their jobs was somehow too much for their imagination. So they called them witches. Fine. The women took the name and made it theirs. But the nickname can make the story sound almost romantic, and it was not romantic. It was exhausting, dirty, cold, dangerous. The regiment lost pilots and crew. Planes returned riddled with holes. Some did not return at all. There were nights when the aircraft caught fire. Nights when searchlights locked onto them. Nights when German guns filled the sky. Nights when a pilot watched another aircraft vanish and had to keep flying because the mission was not finished. The Po-2 was so slow that in some strange cases, German fighters had trouble targeting it because it flew below their stall speed. But slow did not mean safe. Slow meant exposed. Slow meant vulnerable. Slow meant there was more time to hear the bullets. The women also had to fight another war on the ground. The war to be taken seriously. They were soldiers, but many people still saw them as women first and soldiers second. They had to prove themselves repeatedly in a way men did not. Their courage had to be demonstrated over and over as if bravery expired at sunrise. But the results became impossible to ignore. They flew thousands upon thousands of missions. They harassed German positions. They supported Soviet advances. They earned medals, honors, and eventually the respect that should have been there from the beginning. The 508th was later redesignated as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. A mark of distinction, the title Guards was not handed out because someone had a nice personality and filled out the correct forms. It was earned in combat, and the Night Witches earned it in darkness. One of the most famous pilots was Nadezhda Popova. She flew hundreds of missions and survived nights that could have easily ended her life. Another was Yevdokia Barshanskaya, the regiment's commander, who helped turn a unit many had doubted into one of the most remarkable aviation forces of the war. But the power of the story is not only in the famous names. It is in the mechanics, the navigators, the armorers, the ground crews, the women who repaired damaged aircraft with whatever they had, the women who loaded bombs in the dark, the women who kept planes flying when the planes had no business still being in the sky. The night witches were not one or two exceptional heroines standing above everyone else. They were a system of women keeping each other alive in a war that wanted them erased. That is what makes them different from a legend. Legends are clean. War is not. War is mud, bad food, frozen hands, exhaustion, fear, and someone yelling orders while you try to remember whether the engine sounded like that yesterday. The night witches did not win because they were magical. They won because they were disciplined, because they adapted, because they used a weak aircraft in a clever way, because they understood that terror does not always need a giant machine. Sometimes terror is a small plane with its engine cut, gliding over a camp full of men who thought the night belonged to them. And then it did not. There is something almost mythic about the image. Women in open cockpits flying through freezing darkness, engines silent, bombs under the wings, the sky turning hostile beneath them. But the real story is better than myth, because it actually happened. They were not witches. They were pilots. They were not ghosts. They were soldiers. And they did not haunt the German army because they had spells. They haunted it because they kept showing up. That is a different kind of fear. Not the fear of something impossible. The fear of something underestimated. The night witches are often remembered because the nickname is unforgettable. But the nickname is only the doorway. Behind it is a story about sexism, survival, innovation, and the brutal arithmetic of war. They were given outdated aircraft and impossible conditions. They turned those aircraft into weapons. They were mocked. They became feared. They were doubted. They became decorated. They were told, directly or indirectly, that they did not belong in the sky. So they took the sky at night and made the enemy afraid to sleep under it. That is why this story matters. Not because it is cute, not because it is inspirational in the shallow poster on a classroom wall sense, because it shows what happens when people who are underestimated are placed under pressure and refuse to disappear. The night witches did not have the best planes. They did not have the safest missions. They did not have the easiest road to respect. What they had was nerve, skill, endurance, and the kind of courage that does not always look dramatic while it is happening. Sometimes, courage looks like climbing back into the same fragile plane for the 8th time in one night. Sometimes it looks like flying without enough protection, because the mission matters more than comfort. Sometimes it looks like being afraid and going anyway. By the end of the war, the night witches had become one of the most extraordinary combat units of World War II. They had flown tens of thousands of missions. They had helped wear down German forces. They had proven that the people mocked as impossible could become unavoidable. And that is the part history should not forget. The Nazis called them witches because they could not understand them. But the truth is simpler and sharper. They were women. They were pilots. They were soldiers. And they were very, very good at making the dark belong to them. If you made it to the end of this one, genuinely respect. The night witches sound like legend until you remember the wood, the canvas, the cold, the bullets, and the women who climbed into those planes anyway. This channel is about the corners of history where the truth is stronger than the myth. And the truth here is simple. They flew with almost nothing. And still, they terrified an army. Next time, we're going from the freezing skies of World War II to one of Britain's most disturbing institutions where Londoners once paid to watch patients suffer inside the walls of Bedlam. If you want the real story, subscribe. And if this episode changes how you think about the night witches, women in war, or the kind of courage history forgets to thank properly, Drop a comment and tell me what part hit hardest. I read every single one. I'll see you in the dark.